Our next guest is joining us for the first time. Please put your hands together for Century 21 Realtor, Steve Ploetz.
There he is, Steve Ploetz. What's up, my friend? How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, great to have you. Hey, you know, this is something that I think a lot of people believe to be true, and I don't know if it's true or not, but if you're a home buyer, you're driving around, maybe you're going to open houses, you picked up the paper, you're driving around looking at open houses. I think a lot of people believe that the smart thing to do, if you're a buyer, especially in a competitive market like we're in right now, is to reach out to the listing agent and try to gain favor with them and say, hey, you know, if you were my agent, would that help me get this property? And so I think this is an important topic to cover in this type of market, especially where the buyers are empowered, they have access, they can see what homes are for sale, they can drive around and look at them. If you were a buyer in this market, does it make sense to call the listing agent on a home that you're interested in?
I think it's a great question. I don't think that there is a 100% either way, yes or no. I think that what's interesting about the market right now, and particularly when it's a question that I hear often, there is the perception that if, as a buyer, you call the listing agent, that you're getting a good deal. I would say that's most of the time is not accurate. A very simple example would be if you were to ask 100 real estate agents and say, hey, here's the deal. You are in escrow, dual agent, you're representing buyer and seller, and the transaction is going sour and you're going to lose one of those clients. Probably 100 of them say, lose the buyer, stay with the listing. The power is with the seller. And so that kind of shows you up front that the fiduciary responsibility is not split 50-50, that the agent, as much as they're agreeing to in writing to have both parties' interests in mind, it's very, very challenging to do.
How do you do that? I mean, how is that even possible? I mean, a dual agency is a whole other bottle.
Without a doubt. I mean, I hate to think of buyer and seller as oppositional because they're not against each other, or they shouldn't be against each other, but there are negotiations that come up all the time where you need an advocate, whether you're the seller or the buyer, and there's pros and cons to an agent being on both sides of it. As I mentioned, they simply cannot have your 100% fiduciary interest in mind. However, there is more money in the transaction. Most agents, if a typical listing is a 6% listing, some agents will do a variable commission where they will reduce the commission by a percentage point, so now it becomes a 5% listing or something along those lines. So in competitive situations, that can help an offer get won. It's important to know the legal side of it, which is the listing agent is not allowed to give what the offers are at, if it's a multiple offer situation, to any of the buyers, including their own buyer. That information cannot be disclosed. They're allowed to disclose, they're required to disclose the existence of the offers, but also if they are representing any of those buyers. So I think that it ends up in a spot where the balance becomes very tricky. Sometimes the benefit of dual agency is that the agent, if there is more money and buyer is holding firm on a certain dollar amount or a roof repair or all the different negotiations that go into the transaction, and the seller is also unwilling to budge, that sometimes an agent can say, hey, you know what, there's enough money here, we can make it happen I can reduce the commission or give a credit to the buyer or whatever it may be. That would be the benefit. I guess the advice that I would give, the takeaway is, as a buyer, find out, number one, is there the existence of other offers? Are there other offers on the table? Whether you are appealing to the listing agent and asking them to represent you, or you have your own buyer's agent. And then also find out, is that listing agent representing any of those offers? Because that changes the makeup of the situation. And again, agents are not allowed to disclose those offer prices, but when the average real estate agent is doing 1 to 2 deals, does it happen? Unfortunately, it does. And so now the liability of that is obscene. I mean, and I would say that any mistake that is made by the listing agent, no matter how, or the dual agent, no matter how innocent, can be seen as them favoring one party or another. I have a client that just sold a house in Minnesota and has moved out here and purchased up in North County. And their house that they sold in Minnesota, they have an agent that is representing them as the seller and the buyer, and they affectionately refer to her as their double agent, which is just because it's impossible that she can have both parties' interests in mind. And so they've actually said that in every contract that they do moving forward, that they'll never allow dual agency.
But in this market, this is the big question. In this market, is it worth the risk? Because it's so hard for buyers to get into these places. If I'm a buyer and I see a house and I'm like, this is perfect, the neighborhood we want, the setup we want, the layout we want, we love it. Is it worth the risk to go and try to appeal that listing agent?
It is a great question, and I'm not going to dodge it. And it depends. because here's the thing. Residential real estate is bought and sold on emotion. People buy homes primarily as their primary residence, and they buy it based on things like neighborhoods and if this floor plan works and speaks to them, and what about school districts and these kinds of factors. So that emotion starts the transaction. Particularly in multiple offer situations, we see it all the time where a buyer gets caught up in this frenzy of, if I don't sacrifice my first child right now, I'm not going to get the property. So let's sacrifice it. But then logic sets in, and it sets in days later, and that's the whole purpose of this contingency period. The whole purpose of the 17 days where the buyer is drastically protected and they can get inspections and do all of these things. I would say if a buyer is very, very specific about what they know, or very, very specific about what they want, and they want a very specific floor plan, and they want a very specific neighborhood, and they have identified that, then I don't think that there's any problem in going through the listing agent, because they are aware of they've got it already specifically down. If you're beginning, don't go through the listing agent, because it requires so much more due diligence as a buyer. It requires that you yourself, it taints the relationship between agent and buyer significantly, because you always need to be questioning, does this person really have my interests in mind? Are they really working for me? Or are they working for themselves, trying to put together a smooth deal? And I don't think that there's an easy question or an easy answer to that. Certainly, I've probably done it 20 times where I represent buyer and seller, and most of them are smooth. And not all of them are multiple offer situations. There's a demographic that likes to go through the listing agent for whatever.
So is that, in your experience, let's say those 20 times, did that help the buyer? Was it helpful for the buyer to be going through you as the listing agent? That's
a great question. I would say the majority of the time it didn't help the buyer any more than them being represented by another agent. Okay. The commission was the same. I rarely do variable commissions. And had they been represented by another agent, it's not like they got an inside track. And I can only speak about my own personal business, but my buyers and sellers, I don't ask them for their bottom dollar or their top dollar or those numbers, because then if we end up on that number, it appears that maybe I've disclosed that to the other party. So the data speaks for itself oftentimes, and when I meet with a buyer that is interested in one of my listings, we still do the normal, let's look at comps, let's break it down. And there probably has been a couple of times where it was advantageous to the buyer.
But not that often.
But
certainly not a majority.
Certainly not a majority.
Okay.
Yeah, that's 20, I would say 25% it's been advantageous to go through. It's always advantageous to go through me. But no, in terms of dual agency, 75% of the time I would say it's not advantageous.
Okay, that's good information though. That's real information there. So Steve, you're kind of known for this $1 million experience that you have created, and it's basically a philosophy of serving people who are listing their homes for sale, to the extent that you're treating them and their property as though it were a luxury listing. For some people that might not make sense. They might say, well, $1 million, I don't need that. I have a $500,000 house. But explain to us what that is and what you do.
Well, so how it started was when I was a brand new agent. I started in 2005. Everybody's talking about 5-year plan. What's the goal? What do you want to do? So I thought, well, I want to work in the ultra luxury price point. I want to work the $100 million listings, that kind of stuff. And so I shadowed a lot of those agents and saw what they did on big property, Rancho Santa Fe, Del Mar, those neighborhoods where the property average sales price is $5-6 million. And some of the things that I found was the biggest one was staging. I mean, as I talked about before, where residential real estate is bought and sold on emotion, that you can appeal to a lot of that emotional side through some, by staging is probably the biggest, and having a presence online that's very, very strong with professionals and professional photographs and those kinds of things. But the difference is, unlike other agents, is that my goal is to work the $400,000 to $800,000 price point, to be in that, our demographics that are making moves, that are going through life changes of marriage and having children. And I have found that by paying for the staging out of my own pocket up front, there's a couple of strategies and tactics that we can use in order to make sure that we get top dollar, that the property moves quickly, and particularly if let's say our demographic is making a move, that we're moving from a smaller townhome or condo and we're trying to get into a larger detached house, there's the fear of having two transactions at the same time, particularly when the market is the way it is. Being able to lock up the sale and know that this transaction is secure, we can negotiate it out because we will have multiple offers, because we'll be able to negotiate a leaseback, whatever it may be. It allows us to be more aggressive on the purchase side. So often what we see is in that move, clients tend to feel like, well, I've got to sell my house under market or my condo under market in order to secure that sale. And then because the terms that I'm writing are contingent, meaning I need to sell the condo in order to buy the house, I have to overpay for the property. So it's a lose-lose. When in actuality, that simply is not the case with the right strategies in place.
So providing the extra service, the staging, the luxury feel to the average home price in San Diego County, essentially what you're doing is you're investing right alongside your homeowners. You're in the same boat, your interests are aligned, and you're providing an additional service that should help them get more out of the process. That's awesome stuff. Steve Ploetz, fantastic job.
Thank you very much.
He is the creator of the $1 Million Experience. Stick around for more Smarter San Diego TV, where we guarantee to make you smarter than everyone else, commercial free.